abundance is a bunch of different things, right? So like,
yeah. So maybe start that. How do you define abundance?
So here's how I define abundance. So Ezra and Derek have written this incredibly successful policy book. And yes, like it's an airport book, it's a quick read, but policy books like that, even short, accessible ones, do not sell as many books as they have sold. They will have big platforms, they're really good writers. Like this is speaking to a set of people who have like real organic like interest and thoughts behind this. So that's one part of it. The other part is there's a right wing, people call it dark abundance, that in many ways is sort of more of the VCs, like Mark Andreessen, people in the Trump administration. Sort of a lot of the tech right falls into that sort of like right-wing abundance category because they're like, look, like Trump's going to build nuclear, Trump's going to deregulate everything and help us build again. Technology is the way to the American future, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like that's part of the abundance movement as well too, though I would not overstate the use of the word abundance. And then there are sort of like this, I think, unhelpful sort of version of abundance that in many ways is this center that was finding itself in a defensive position after November, December, where they said, okay, we have to moderate on LGBTQ issues, we have to moderate on immigration, et cetera, but we actually do need to have something like forward-facing to say, and they've adopted abundance as part of that project. Because though the project is like moderating and making the Democratic Party more centrist, abundance has been mixed into that. What I'm trying to do with my work from my small podcast perch is build out abundance as a broader sort of approach or set of policies and questions that any sort of like from the center to the left of really think about. And I think the way that I tell this story, and I'm not saying this as a dunk on you, because this has become a sort of cliche, but I'm actually asking, did you read the book Abundance?
Yes.
Okay, so you know this.
I listened to it, but yes.
The first chapter is this like 2050 vision of the future where like technology and growth provided us all these different like great things. I actually really did not like that first chapter, especially from the perspective of articulating to the left why they should actually care about these ideas. Because I think, A, to your point, we live in an era where people are backlashing against oligarchy, where people like aren't excited about technology, where we're debating smartphones. Like that is a version of the book, because this book was supposed to come out in 2024. I suspect if they were to start this project today, the book first chapter would be a little different. Yeah. So my pitch for what the first chapter should have looked like is rooted in me not being a New Yorker or a San Franciscan, which is where a lot of the YIMBY house people come from, but me being like a Texan. I live in Austin. I live next to the Hill Country, and I haven't looked at the books in a while, but The Path to Power, that Robert Caro's biography, LBJ, is no longer back there. But that was a really like informative book for like Sagar and my politics. And here's my favorite chapter of the book. It talks about how in 1937, LBJ is a congressman. And during the New Deal, there was something called the Rural Electrification Administration. And what it literally did was bring power to rural America. Right. We'd had electricity in the country for more than 50 years, but the private sector was not delivering electricity to the Hill Country, to poor, like hardscrabble farmers. And what the New Deal did, they used a combination of private actors and public actors to create these co-ops that brought, and Robert Caro's telling, I really recommend people read this book, brought people into the 20th century from the Stone Age, effectively. People were like, didn't have power, now they have power. That is a vision of broad left liberalism that delivered for people and really mattered and got over the actual like objections and things that wouldn't make that happen. So rooting abundance in this story of like, wow, like it used to be that we had like a majoritarian left liberal politics that could fundamentally change people's lives by delivering them things that are powered by technology, that are powered by different forms of like organizing, and when the private sector or the public sector can't get it done, that's really what I want abundance to be rooted in. And I think the first chapter of the book that would be pitched to the left would be rooted not in the future in a way that people aren't really bought into, but just in the like, why was it that 1930s liberalism could deliver? But if you asked basically anyone, they would say that like New York, California, et cetera, all these like bastions of like left liberalism can't really deliver. That's why I want abundance to be rooted in.
I think the whole country can't deliver though. I mean, I am perfectly willing and happy to admit I'm in favor of, zoning reform, that there are, ways that the Texas housing zoning policy is superior to the California zoning policy. But I feel like the differences between Texas and California are less important than the differences between America now and America during the New Deal, as you're laying out. And so, I was telling you before, I feel a little bit gaslit on abundance because sometimes it'll be pitched to me this way of like, we're just talking about the New Deal. Like, you like the New Deal, right, bro? And I'm like, yeah, I like the New Deal. And then other times it's pitched like, screw Zoran Mondani, and we just need to, effectively, like, abundance is just a new pitch for neoliberalism, where we get the regulators out of the way and these out-of-touch do-gooder liberals so that the big business can do their thing. And it can't be both of these things. So there is a part there, the goals of abundance, who could disagree with, right? Building more stuff, building more housing, making housing more affordable, actually being able to do the high-speed rail, like really building out. And this is where there's another, I think, tension within abundance, like really building out the capability to move into a green energy future. But to your point about there's this other part of abundance that also is very fossil fuel aligned and is, exists in the Trump administration, which does not actually want that green energy future. It certainly starts to feel like, okay, this is being used, whatever the intentions of, various people in the movement are, it's being used as a way to stop a shift in the Democratic Party that would otherwise organically happen and that you see happening towards, a framing around corporate power and checking oligarchy. And so that's where the concern comes in, is that you've got this moment, you have this reckoning with the wreckage of neoliberalism that has been repudiated sort of across the board here and around the world, by the way. You have a moment where Bernie and AOC have never been more popular, not just with the original Bernie base, but with the broader Democratic Party. You have a really clear reckoning with oligarchy, which has been made, abundantly evident by the Trump administration and Elon and Doge and the tech right, and having all of those oligarchs behind him at the inauguration, and the way that so much of their policy is driven towards providing for the billionaire class. You also have this reckoning with AI coming, where these people are trying to become the first trillionaires and eliminate like half of the jobs. And into this marches effectively what appears to me to be basically like a rebranding of neoliberalism to say, oh no, this is new and different, but really try to preserve the status quo. And that's where, I think evidence for this in terms of the way it's being used is by how eagerly it's being accepted by the Richie Torreses of the world, by the entire Senate Democratic caucus, and the establishment Democratic figures who are most comfortable with trying to preserve the status quo.
Yeah, and I think that I'll offer you kind of a rubric here. So you should know that when I was sort of giving my pitch for abundance, I wasn't saying, and we need to get America back to growth. Growth is the key thing. Growth, 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 growth. You'll kind of hear that from sort of like the right wing, like tech billionaire crowd here. That is like the version of abundance, which is basically just like a substitute for like neoliberalism. Just
it's
a substitute for
deregulate
like rehashed 1990s. Yeah. And so like that is a key thing that I really should like offer here. But let's go back to the Zoran conversation. What I love about abundance, and this is like the key thing, we're going to talk about this poll in a second, but there's a poll out there by Demand Progress that revealed that abundance messaging is far less popular when you're not door knocking for voters than a more like populist centric pitch. So I think that's fine. Like, that is not a shocker. Like, if you are running for office right now, you should not be talking about bottlenecks. And like the fact that like our NEPA laws have made it so permitting doesn't like, that is not the pitch. The pitch is that like Elon Musk is like literally killing kids in Africa. He's cutting your grandmother off of Social Security so a bunch of like 18-year-old, dudes can like play around and pretend they're like new dealers or something like that. Like, that is what you are talking about right now. And to your point about Zoran, you're also talking about like housing and affordability, like actual, not just like housing in the abstract, but like actually like I am meeting you as a voter and I'm recognizing the number one thing you're worried about right now is how truly precarious American life is right now. So like that is what the actual like electoral pitch is. But what abundance should be in response to voters not being jazzed about bottleneck reforms is a toolkit to help politicians actually think through how freaking complicated and difficult it is to navigate this country. So back when I was first getting into policy, if you're talking about people, talking to people about housing, we just say like, yeah, like rent control, or, like, let's just like kind of do that. Abundance expands the set of policies in a bigger direction. So it says, okay, Zoran, so like, I'm not going to convince Zoran in any way whatsoever that rent control isn't what like New Yorkers are demanding or what wouldn't be a form of delivery for his base. But what I could offer with the abundance toolkit is, but hey, we really should also build more housing because there's a real gap and shortage of housing. And yes, there are 2 million New Yorkers who want rent control, but there's also like other New Yorkers who don't have apartments right now in the first place and need apartments to actually exist in the first place. So my real and the good news here too is
which he embraces.
Yeah, and so great. Right, that is what yes and looks like. And once again, yes and should also be rooted in that Kamala Harris poll and ad thing we talked about earlier, where it's like voters love more housing. Talk about the New Deal era. Like, what did Harry Truman do after he comes into office? There was a housing shortage in America when Soviet GIs came back. We built more housing. Like, this is something we have to be able to do in this country. So we're gonna have to come up with a broad mix of doing these different things. I think part of the issue too of abundance, like kind of Ezra and Derek are pundits. Like, that is their job. Like, if you're a pundit, you know this. Like, you have to make your argument, dial it up to 120%, and advance the argument. So they, in their argument, really focus this on the deregulatory story. The reason why I went back to the New Deal story in terms of my telling of abundance is more just that we should be focused at this point in the conversation, or let me put it this way, because people can have whatever conversations they want. We should root our abundance conversations when we're trying to engage between like the center and the left in objectives and then work our way backwards rather than just sort of saying, hey guys, guess what? Deregulation is the answer to all of your problems. Because you're not going to agree with that. What I want you to agree with me here, and I suspect you will, is we need to approach housing through a bunch of different vectors.
Yes.
Rent control is not going to solve everything. That's your concession. I'm going to concede that if we magically also, we're not going to magically just relax zoning across the country because it's incredibly unpopular. Ironically enough, even with moderate centrist voters, I live in the Texas suburbs. I promise you, and this is also why the centrist abundance project is going to run into a weird place. I promise you, my centrist Texas voters definitely would they're down for the moderate on social and cultural issues part. They are not down for a mass YIMBY deregulatory program that fundamentally transforms the suburbs. So we're both going to have to make some sort of concession here and build an approach together. And that starts with recognizing, wow, we need to get more housing for people and make housing more affordable. That's a bunch of different approaches.
I agree with all of that. When you read the book, that is not actually the message of the book. And I think one of the things that has been useful to me in listening to the realignment is helping to understand, okay, the book is not the entirety there are different factions here, and the book is not the entirety of the movement. But when we were talking about narratives before, the narrative of the book is that there were these liberal do-gooders who put a bunch of regulations in place, well-intentioned, that have outserved their usefulness and need to go. And a lot of this becomes very squishy because there are difficult moral choices involved in, pushing to the side any of these, regulations or any of the interest groups involved in what Ezra Klein calls everything bagel liberalism. So he never wants to actually say and that's why we shouldn't use prevailing wage standards, right? Or that's why we shouldn't require childcare as part of building these projects. Or that's why we shouldn't do environmental review. Or that's why we shouldn't have these air protections to make sure that when we do build public housing that poor people aren't suffering from asthma and other conditions that would be avoidable. That's all kind of pushed to the side so that it feels like there are no difficult moral choices that have to be made there when there actually are. So that's number one. Number two is what I would say is on some of the concrete examples about, zoning regulation and about building out green energy, I don't disagree. What I disagree with is making that story the central story to politics. Yep. Because it's not that it's not part of the picture, but I don't think it is the central story to politics whatsoever. And just to give one example, when they did this massive study to look at, okay, when zoning reform has been implemented, what has been the impact on the housing supply? And it's not that it had no impact, but it increased housing supply by 0.8%. So to have it as part of the agenda and to understand these issues in terms of governance and being able to better deliver, yes, absolutely. If you're trying to supplant an anti-oligarch agenda with a YIMBY agenda and a deregulatory agenda, yes, those two things are actually at odds with each other. And I think they fail. I think they fail on both I think abundance as this narrow, we need to deregulate project fails both on the policy level to deliver the things that we would want to deliver and on a political level in terms of winning elections at a time when, the stakes are really existential. If you zoom out for a minute, here we are and I don't know if we agree on all of the contours of this, but I think we're witnessing the rise of a sort of like would-be fascism and techno-authoritarianism. You have these, powerful billionaires who have vast control over our government, who are doing things like, just cutting the funding of USAID so that millions of people around the world may die as a result of those cuts. We're stripping the social safety net, who are deregulating AI so that there's just this, massive rush into an AI arms race that could have completely devastating consequences for the human race, but in the more immediate term is certainly going to cause significant labor and worker displacement. And this agenda is being pursued at a rapid and terrifying pace. And so to fight back against that with zoning reform and, getting the regulations out of the way, it's just, to me, it feels so wildly inadequate to the moment and what we actually need to deliver as a, counter-political project to what is rapidly coalescing in this country right now.
Yeah, so two things. So number one, I want to focus on like the liberal do-gooder deregulation story because I think it's like really important. So what's been unfortunate from an abundance perspective is like Derek and Ezra, because the size of their audience has just blotted out the sun. There was another book about abundance that also came out a month before. It's called Why Nothing Works by Mark Dunkleman. It's a very, very good, frankly, it's actually a much better book. It's 100 pages longer. Okay. People, if you want to really learn about these books, you should read these books.
Why Nothing Works.
Why Nothing Works. And what Mark does an amazing job is he tells this abundance story through the lens of like debates about America and the left and liberalism through the 20th century. So here's the way he tells the story. In the 1930s, he explains this that liberalism, and by the way, I know people, this, people get so nitpicky with the terms. I'm basically describing like left of like center-left thought in America, extends all the way out. During the 1930s, the way he explains this is liberalism has like two instincts. Like one is like the Hamiltonian instinct. After like Alexander Hamilton, it's big, it's making moves, it's trying to force change, it's aggressive. So the New Deal was a Hamiltonian project. We were going to, once again, electrify the hill country. We're going to build the TVA. We are going to build the Hoover Dam. We're going to do all these big, big, big things and bring America into the 20th century while also like regulating capitalism, all these like different aspects.
Right.
So that created a lot of like really great stuff. It also though, and this is why I think this needs to be more rooted in the story of abundance, it created a lot of bad things. Like what is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring about? Like what were all those 19s? What is Ralph Nader's like Unsafe at Any Speed? All of these sort of like left movements that came out of the 1960s looked at a lot of like the benefits of what we got from that Hamiltonian New Deal era, where we also had business and government working and labor working very, very comfortably, a little too entangled together. There was a real industrial complex there. We got a lot of benefit, but we also got crazy costs. We have Robert Moses like destroying whole neighborhoods of people in New York City. We had the pollution, we had all these different issues. So that activated a Jeffersonian instinct, once again named after Thomas Jefferson. Once again, this is me just citing Mark here, but the Jeffersonian instinct is like, nah, what about the people? What about the local community? Did anyone ask like a small community of Black people in New York City whether they agree with Robert Moses's grand Hamiltonian vision of what the 20th century city looked like?
Right.
So coming into the 60s and 70s, as we focused more on the costs of everything liberalism accomplished, we got movements that said, hey, like let's focus on the on the downsides of that. And that's really important. And I would really push back on your idea that the best version of abundance says we're just going to jettison. We're going to jettison those regulations because they are just slowing us down and they're a whole problem. No, like democracy, like all of our politics needs to be rooted in a belief in democracy. And once again, a balancing of the Hamiltonian vision and the Jeffersonian vision. So the way that he kind of explains this is what's going to work out during this era is how do we balance the recognition, and I think this is what the Green New Deal is, the definition of a Hamiltonian project.
Right.
The Green New Deal recognizes that in a climate crisis, America has to move. It has to move fast. It has to be big in its ambitions. We're not going to get this done via a bunch of tax credits to a bunch of corporations to get this done.
Right.
That's Hamiltonian. The
Right.
Jeffersonian side, though, is, hey, a Hamiltonian project that is premised on us bulldozing the entire country, not listening to communities who may have pollution, not listening to local communities who have their own action, is also not going to work. So what I'm trying to do with my work, and this is why I'm really grateful to have a platform to talk about this here, is how do we actually balance the Hamiltonian instinct with the Jeffersonian instinct? And I think if Ezra and Derek spoke from the perspective more of like balancing those dynamics, and that's what we're trying to really get to. How do we recognize a climate crisis? How do we recognize the fact that we really need to how do we recognize the fact that we need to reshore our semiconductors in this country with the fact that we have local communities and democracy? So that's what I'm trying to basically get to. And the last thing in the second part of your response is, look, I think an abundance, and this is why I said that Ezra and Derek are doing the pundit thing where they dial everything up to 120% to sell their argument. Everyone does this, right? This isn't a left, right, or center thing. I think there's been a serious overstatement of effect of abundance agenda policies. And I don't want to I would, and that's why my pitch for what we do moving forward, I'm doing this on my own end, other people are thinking about this too. And the good news too, when I talk about this on the podcast, I get input from actual politicians and actual staffers of what they're looking for is what we're talking about this here too. Like that's actually the funny thing. Like most people are not actually looking to do a big like centrist versus like progressive fight. Most people recognize what time it is and how we need to build something together. So my point is, let's focus on, I would love to sit down with Zoran right here and say, look, let's just start with the fact that housing is a crisis and we need more of it and it needs to be more affordable. And then we work our way backwards to how we actually get there. If abundance people are not willing to do that, then A, they're not going to gain political power in the first place, given your point, but B, it's not going to work.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.